technology is as much problematic for a culture as it is glorious. And we have to give some attention to the problematic part of it.
Neil Postman wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985, warning us about the effects he saw television was having and would have on society. He feared that entertainment would become our primary form of discourse. So, we revisit Postman's thoughts 37 years later to ask what Postman would think about the role of media in our world now.
Okay, so what do you think Postman would think about our world now?
Well, Postman would be disappointed on one hand, but surprised on the other. I think our media observations showed that people are actually quite active in their media usage in a way that Postman didn't see at the time, and they aren't just getting brainwashed. But on the other hand, we have so much media now that there's often not enough context for people to really get to understand things. And I think this is discussed by Bird and Godwin, who are saying that we really need context to engage with a piece of media and understand where it comes from and what kind of message it's delivering.
I think you bring up such a true and important point about how much media we have now to deal with. I think the amount of content we have today makes it really hard to decipher what's true and what's not, who's defining the truth and who isn't. And I think we bring a lot of prejudices, knowledge, personal experience, and identity to everything we come across in media. And I'm curious, Will, how have your own prejudices and biases affected your viewing experience?
Yeah, wow, thanks, Alex. That's a really good question because with a film like Endless Summer, for example, you have this generation of people that this connects super strongly with and even inspires them to go out and become surfers. And it's so interesting because the authenticity of the film is what connects and inspires them. But that authenticity is based on a half-truth. Mike and Robert really did travel all the way around the world surfing, but the film makes a lot of incorrect assumptions about cultures they really knew nothing about. And like Lederman says, the waves of those assumptions travel vast distances back to affect the cultures they talk about.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, especially when they made it to Africa and stuff like that, because the first time I saw this movie, I was like, oh wow, I didn't know it was that big of a thing, or all the way around the world. But going back, it's just they've always done this. They've always surfed, they've always known what it is, but it's really hard to tell just based off of seeing the movie once that the filmmakers are blind to that. So I thought that was really interesting to see it back the second time, and it kind of shows the true colors of what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And then Whitewash comes out, which I would assume less people have seen, which is such a shame because it goes into detail about the inaccuracies of the film and how they were used to show a world open to discovery at a time when minorities and black people specifically were being actively kept away from water sports like surfing. So it's just a shame that these biases end up as people's mental maps and lead to a general public's idea about how the world works when that's incorrect.
You guys bring up a really good point about what's being told and what's being shown versus what's happening in reality. And I think the media plays a really large role in constructing our mental maps, which if you take a movie like Moana, which essentially is mistelling the history of Polynesian culture, which I wasn't thinking about the first time I watched the film, and I bet kids aren't either, who the film really targets. Enculturation is another important thing to discuss here. Along the same lines of forming mental maps, these films are creating the ways we're learning about characteristics, norms of groups and cultures. And if these movies are what we watch, it's a piece of forming our ideas about Polynesian people. And just because it's animated doesn't excuse the falsehoods necessarily around the film.
That's a great point, Alex. Overall, Disney really lacks the cultural depth to tell these truthful stories. And like Garreau says in his 2016 article about Disney Magic, we are vulnerable to these filmmakers' depictions, and we're vulnerable to the corporate giants, which make every effort to expand inwardly, the psyche and emotional life of the individual in order to utilize the human potential in the service of market society. And Garreau really emphasizes how the Walt Disney Company exercises a highly disproportionate concentration of control over the means of producing, circulating, and exchanging information, especially to kids. So how can we better inform these consumers, and we can seek these truths without these falsehoods and propaganda through films like for Sama.
Yeah, like for Sama, for me, was more, in a way, detached from Moana to a point where you look at Moana, it's an animated film, so you just kind of feel like you're watching it, while For Sama is basically a point of view documentary, and you kind of feel like you're there the entire time. So that inherently, for me at least, kind of just made me a little bit more connected to what was going on. I just thought that throughout the entire movie, when the bad things did happen, I mean, obviously it was more graphic than Moana is, but it just made me feel a little bit worse for what was going on over there. So yeah, that just really was one thing that stood out for me.
Yeah, going off that, Holmes and Castaneda, they really asked the question, like, what can anthropology contribute regarding, like, these refugee crises? And it overall, like, they point out, it creates an awareness of the political, economic, and symbolic contexts that are the product of the experiences of these refugees and migrants, and it offers, like, alternative possibilities for the meaning and making for responses. And just overall, like, films like For Sama, this like type of media provides a rehumanizing framework and adds more context to like what refugees are doing and why.
And even going off of that, that kind of brings me to City of God, because they did have an opportunity to show that with the like slums and the favela of Brazil, but they did make the mistake in production or in the filmmaking that made Americans, as we read, feel like it's kind of just like an action movie or just kind of like a normal day, like movie about kids shooting each other. So it kind of lost that opportunity to show, hey, there are really problems going on in these places, and like the same problems that we have in America, just like racism and police killing and all that stuff. So even in the I Went to the City of God article, I read that after analyzing the film and all that, even Brazilian and non-Brazilian authors have used the film as a platform to discuss aesthetic and political choices of new Brazilian cinema, also social economic inequality and violence within the contemporary societies that we see in the movie. So I thought it's really cool that we're able to look back and actually see that we missed all these things.
I think one thing you were touching on there is how the meaning is created by both the producers and consumers of media, and I think this leads to our last question of who's really more responsible here. Is it the people that are watching things, or is it the people that are creating things for other people to watch? Because at the end of the day, it's both parties coming together to create some sort of meaning. And this leads back to Bert and Godwin that we brought in at the very beginning, talking about how there's so much media here today, and the films are very dependent on the audience. And yet, the producers can try to have a intended audience, but it's not always who they think it is, and I think that's kind of what we saw with City of God.
Yeah, and even just going off of that, like in class we've talked about it, how if anthropologists watch all the things that we were watching, they'd think what we're kind of talking about right now and what we're thinking, but that's really not what they make the movies for. Like, they are making them for people, and when a normal person's going to watch this, they're not going to think all these things.
Yeah, and I think this is what Postman is trying to get at in chapter 3, that when we watch these types of media, like, what we need to have is conversation, because conversation is connection and discussion is about understanding and purpose. And that's what makes educational programming so dangerous, is because it's not asking questions or holding conversations. And so I think Postman really wants us to create more of a social element whenever we are intaking this media, and we need to properly understand of, what television is doing to us. And I think in Won't You Be My Neighbor, we can see that Mr. Rogers really understood the impact he had on children, and he was really proactive in what he was teaching, and like that he was giving the right lessons to his audience. And even in the interviews, we can see that he was creating real human connection, which is what Postman was afraid of, is that we are losing human connection through the screen. We can't deny how captivating media is today in our globalizing world, and nevertheless, we can't forget that the power of television isn't something that should be feared, and instead make people more conscious and critical of what we watch and how it affects them.